have a bone to pick with Book Talk. Okay, that's not entirely true. I don't have a bone to pick with Book Talk, but I do have a bone to pick with an article that was recently published in Bloomberg titled "TikTok is Turning the Publishing World into Fast Fashion." And as a graduate student who studies fashion, I have a lot to say about this article. So we're gonna get into it. Before we get started, hello, my name is Katie. I'm a graduate student at Parsons School of Design in a program called Fashion Studies, where I study the sociocultural phenomenon of fashion. My particular research interest is in vintage fashion and how our conceptions of vintage fashion have changed through time, but I do generally have to learn about fashion, what it is, what it means to people, the fashion industry, including fast fashion, and the consumption of fashion. So this article that was published in Bloomberg is really a response to the imprint that is responsible for publishing Rebecca Yaros's book, Fourth Wing. For a much more publishing-oriented perspective of this article, I would really recommend going and watching My Name is Marinez's YouTube video about this, because she has a totally different perspective than I do. She talks about this kind of relationship between social media and the publishing industry, and that it's not necessarily Book Talk's fault. And where are we getting this conversation between social media and especially TikTok, and then the consequences that we might see in our physical world? So, while I understand that this Bloomberg article is more about the criticisms that are being levied against the poor quality of writing and the poor quality of books themselves, the actual object of a book and the publication, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to bring a fashion studies perspective, and here's my problem with this conversation generally. Generally speaking, yes, there is an issue of overconsumption, but it is equating bad quality writing and the overconsumption of books to one of the top polluting industries that is also known for its human rights violations. To quote from the article, it says, "We're witnessing in real time how corners of the publishing industry have become akin to fast fashion, pushing out a steady stream of content because they know readers, influenced by social media reviews, will keep buying despite any glaring ethical concerns." What those ethical concerns are, the author does not really get into any of the details. Now, I can see where some of these parallels are, especially if we take how social media and platforms like TikTok can influence things like fashion trends at speeds faster than we've ever seen in fashion history. However, it's also important to note that this idea of speed and change have always been central to how we understand what fashion is. Fashion through history has been discussed not necessarily in what it represents in this moment in time, but the fact that it's different from the fashion that we used to have. So as we are ever continuously pursuing this idea of modernity or being modern and expressing that through our clothing, we are always searching for the next new thing in fashion, which is one of the reasons why fashion has accelerated at the pace that it has. But getting back to my point, fast fashion brands like H&M and Shein are able to respond to social media fueled trends much faster than ever before, especially with the advent of industrialization and the sewing machine. It wasn't until that industrial revolution and we had the sewing machine where we were able to speed up the process of creating a garment. Additionally, styles have changed so that they are no longer as tailored as they once were, not as fitted to the body, which would require more personable, like one-on-one tailoring for each individual. And we also have stretchy fabrics that didn't used to exist, which can conform to a body without the need to make them specific to somebody's detailed measurements. So these fast fashion brands are now able to push out these trends much faster than ever, putting out new designs every week, hell, sometimes even every day, in response to this ever-searching cycle for newness. When it comes to the book side of TikTok, the same algorithmic mechanisms that push people to overconsume fashion can also push people to overconsume books. But it's to a certain extent. YouTuber, according to Alina, points out that reading a book and preparing thoughtful commentary takes a lot longer than simply showing the camera your most recent book haul, making book haul content not only easier to make, but also more appealing to the algorithm, as it is also faster to make, and the turnover rate for new content on platforms like TikTok is set at breakneck speeds. However, it is still not as fast as fashion. Fashion, you buy the item, you put it on your body, you wear it, take a picture, take a video, whatever, and that can be the end of it. Ostensibly, with book hauls, you are showing those books with the thought in mind that you are going to read them at some point, which then immediately, inherently at that moment, makes the consumption of books take longer. than fashion. Do you see what I'm getting at? Additionally, one of my biggest problems with this comparison of content production to garment production is because they are not the same. Garment production requires much more resources, both in terms of raw material and human labor, than the publishing industry ever will. And this is something I haven't seen anyone talk about yet. According to Alina's video, it does talk about the environmental impact, kind of, but when we think about fast fashion, it's not just the environment we're thinking about, it's that very real human labor exploitation that goes into it. With this in mind, I took it upon myself to actually drop some comparisons between the two industries. Fashion slash fast fashion, gosh, I'm gonna tongue twister myself through this video, and book publishing. So let's look at those similarities and differences between these two industries, primarily focusing again on the environmental impact and the human labor that goes into publishing and fashion, so we can see how, in my opinion, we should not be equating the publishing industry with the fashion industry. Let's start with the environmental impact. For book publishing, I actually found it rather difficult to find reliable and detailed information, like actual numbers, regarding the environmental impact of the publishing industry, but here's what I know about the resources that go into making a book. First, we have wood pulp to make paper. Commercial forestry for timber and wood pulp contributes to deforestation and forest degradation, which is also a large driver of biodiversity loss that accounts for around 1/10 of global greenhouse gas emissions. According to wordsrated.com, which provided rather vague information, not detailed at all, and also not sourced, the publishing industry in the US alone uses around 32 million trees a year to produce books. Agriculturally speaking, we use agricultural products to make ink, and it seems to me that inks are either petroleum-based or vegetable-based, both of which have their pitfalls, although it is acknowledged that vegetable-based inks are more environmentally friendly than petroleum-based inks for obvious reasons. These vegetable-based inks usually use soy, and we use a lot of land to grow soy, which is another major cause of deforestation. Granted, most of soy production does go to feeding animals that we then eat, so meat production is also a part of that equation. When it comes to water, depending on the mill, it can take up to 13 liters of water to produce a single sheet of paper, which for say a 300-page book would be almost 4,000 liters of water, or about 1,000 gallons for my American folks, to make enough pages to make a book. Keep all these numbers in mind. I'll put them up on the screen somewhere because they're going to be important for later. Metals. Metals including aluminum to produce printing plates and gold and copper for foil stamping are currently used in print publishing. Mining for metals causes biodiversity loss, soil erosion, and contamination of water and soil. Next is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are essential for most mill and printing operations, as well as for product transport, which obviously contributes to climate change. Additionally, wordsrated.com says that each year consumers waste more than 16,000 truckloads of books which have not been read once, but they don't really clarify what kind of truckload or how many books that would be, so I find this kind of a questionable statistic. But clearly the book publishing does have some kind of environmental impact to produce, transport, and purchasing new books. But honestly, the numbers were really fuzzy. Additionally, it was estimated that around 500,000 to 1 million books are published annually, with numbers heading towards 4 million if you include self-published books, but these are just titles. I couldn't find an actual number for how many books are printed annually. So say we have, conservatively, 1 million titles that are published every year. Depending on how many of those are printed, we don't know. That's a lot of books. Editing Katie here. I did actually find a number for the amount of books that are produced. BookRiot.com reports that in 2006, 4.12 million books were produced in the United States. That number is nearly 20 years old at this point, and I wasn't able to find any newer numbers than that. So take it with a grain of salt. But when it comes to fashion, over 100 billion with a B, 100 billion garments are produced annually worldwide. Do you know how many millions have to go into 1 billion to get to 1 billion? It's 1,000 millions. 1,000 millions go into 1 billion. 100 billion garments are produced annually. I know I'm belaboring this point a little bit, but that is mind-blowing to me. I can't get over it. Fashion is responsible for 10% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions and 20% of global wastewater, and uses more energy than the aviation and shipping sectors combined. Now, this is less than the 20% of greenhouse gas emissions that were reported by wordsrated.com for the book publishing industry, but again, there's some discrepancy with the sourcing of those numbers, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But back to fashion, let's look at some of the resources that go into fashion, shall we? Because it's a lot. These are going to be a little bit out of order from the way the books were ordered, but just bear with me, okay? It'll make sense. At least it makes sense in my head. First, we have water. Global fashion consumes 93 billion metric tons of clean water each year, which is, according to the Columbia Climate School, about half of what Americans drink annually to stay alive. Agriculturally speaking, many fashion items are made from plants, cotton being a very, very popular one, and cotton is a thirsty crop. To grow the 1 kilogram of cotton that is used to produce 1 pair of jeans, you can use anywhere from 7,500 to 10,000 liters of water, the amount a person would drink over 10 years of their life. Like, excuse me? Cotton production also requires the use of pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides, which pollutes the soil and water runoff, and the dyeing process of fabrics, which uses toxic chemicals, is responsible for 17 to 20% of global industrial water pollution. Next is wood pulp. Who knew that there are so many similarities between book production and fashion production? So did you know that the fashion industry also uses wood pulp? Fabrics like rayon and viscose are semi-synthetic fabrics that are made from wood pulp, which contributes to the 70 million tons of trees that are cut down each year for the fashion industry alone. 70 million tons of trees for the fashion industry alone. Fossil fuels! Polyester and other synthetic fabrics are essentially byproducts of petroleum. That's right, if you're looking at that materials tag in your shirt and it says polyester, well, polyester is essentially just a type of plastic, and plastic is made from petroleum, which is a fossil fuel. The more you know. Fossil fuels are also essential to the transport of products, and the thing about the global fashion industry is that most of your fashion items are not made in one place. They are usually grown in one place. Often, if it's cotton, it is actually coming from the United States. It's then transported somewhere else to be spun and woven into fabric, which it's then transported somewhere else to be dyed, which it's then sent somewhere else to be cut and sewn into garments, and then sent somewhere else for finishing, then packaging, distribution. It goes all over the world before it reaches you. Additionally, petroleum is used for the plastics for packaging and hangers that are involved in the fashion industry. Because so many fashion garments are made from petroleum-based materials, they are also responsible for a lot of microplastic pollution. It's estimated that 35% of microplastics in the ocean come from the fashion industry, because every time you wash something made from polyester or any other derivative of petroleum that we can turn into fabric, it releases these microplastics into the environment. And lastly is waste. 53 million metric tons of discarded clothing are incinerated or go to landfills every single year. And if they don't make it to a landfill here in the US, instead maybe going to a thrift store, those clothes often don't end up in the thrift stores here in America. Those clothes are often shipped off to other countries, making it someone else's problem. So, it's clear that both industries use a lot of raw materials to actually produce what it is that they're producing. But it's also clear and very, very, very evident from the problems that we are having, we are feeling as an effect of fast fashion and fashion generally, that the amount of resources that fast fashion consumes and the amount of clothing that is produced and the amount of clothing that ends up in waste is far more significant than the publishing industry ever has and potentially ever will. Overall, BookRiot.com reports that it's actually really difficult to assess the overall carbon footprint of the book industry, but one report estimates the total carbon footprint at 12.4 million metric tons of CO2, which I find confusing because they say it's about a 3 kilogram CO2 equivalent per book. Essentially, each book creates or produces 3 kilograms of a carbon footprint. Meanwhile, it's reported that the fashion industry produces 1.2 million metric tons of CO2 every year, although it is about 33.4 kilograms of carbon equivalent for a single pair of jeans. So I'm finding some discrepancies in these numbers, which leads me to my next point, which is basically just that there's a transparency issue. Both industries are seemingly incredibly opaque, and this is something that we know about fashion. In most cases, we just simply don't know. We don't know the actual impact for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, we don't know where most fashion companies produce their garments, where they source their materials, and they often slide under the radar of local laws and regulations because it is so decentralized. So many reports and books and academic articles discuss how it's really difficult to follow the chain of production. A lot of people in this production shindig simply don't know where these materials are coming from. Additionally, a lot of investigative reporters and journalists, for example, when they ask questions, people aren't willing to tell them because they know that they are, again, sliding under these local laws and regulations. Additionally, furthermore, a lot of fashion companies purposefully outsource the labor of production to other countries where these laws and regulations are not as strict. So they are purposefully going out of their way to take advantage of that. Because of this, we see such disasters like the Rana Plaza collapse in 2012, which was a fashion factory that collapsed despite warnings that the building was not built to code to support the heavy industrial sewing machines. It was originally built as a shopping mall, and that resulted in the foundation breaking, collapsing, and injuring thousands and killing hundreds. Some small changes have been made in recent years in terms of transparency with the Fashion Transparency Index, which is, I love them. They produce a report annually, and this year, of the 220 fashion brands that they examined, about 50% of them are finally disclosing their first tier manufacturers, which is essentially just where the clothes are being made. So in terms of traceability of their supply chain, they haven't told us much more than where the final garment is being produced. Additionally, over 50% of those 220 fashion brands tell us nothing. And I also want to point out that there are more than 220 fashion brands out there. These are just simply the largest fashion brands that are there. So my conclusion of this section is that we need more transparency on both ends, the publishing industry as well as the fashion industry. But you don't see books washing up on the shores of Ghana like we saw clothes washing up on the shores of Ghana in the summer of 2022. So clearly there's a discrepancy in the amount of production and consumption between the book industry and the fashion industry. Now that I have belabored that point, I want to turn your attention to another point, something we haven't talked about yet: human labor. Because let's face it, your clothes are made by someone. We don't have the technology yet, nor should we, in my opinion, to fully automate the making of clothing. At almost every single step of the way, there were human hands that touched your clothing. From the growing of the cotton to the finishing of seams, a person made your clothes. And more often than not, under really horrific conditions. Books, on the other hand, not so much. Again, it's a bit of a murky story, but here's what I know about how books are actually made, and I'll leave a link to the New York Times article that I referenced for this section below so you can read it for yourself. But of course, creating a book requires some kind of human labor. Someone has to write the book, design the book, and monitor the printing presses as they operate. But the majority of the labor is done by automated printing presses. The human labor involved in book publishing seems to be mostly within transportation of materials in the printing process, changing the printing plates, and again, monitoring for quality. Machines are even responsible for the folding of pages. Machines are used to trim, glue, and bind those pages together. The point is, while there is some level of human labor involved in book publishing, it is not to the extent that it is in fashion, and much of the process is automated with printing presses. I'm certain that it depends on the mill, and it also depends on the level of exclusive qualities in a book, like sprayed edges or special designs, but suffice it to say, we can automate printing. Fashion, like I said, has human hands touching every part of the production process, all except maybe the textile production process of spinning and weaving the fabric. But we simply don't have the technology to reliably produce a garment. They're too complex of shapes, as they're meant to be worn on complexly shaped, three-dimensional, moving, living, breathing bodies. It's not something that can be standardized. Try as hard as the fashion industry might standardize sizing. Additionally, the fashion industry spends a lot of effort creating and responding to trends, and you can't have trending fashion with templates, which is essentially what's required for the automation of anything, having a template. That's why the printing press can be used to automate printing a book. Of the 75 million garment factory workers around the world, it's estimated that only 2% of them earn a living wage. To keep brands from moving to another country or region with lower costs, Factories limit wages and are disinclined to spend money to improve working conditions like we saw with the Rana Plaza. People saw the cracks in the walls of the building, reported them, and still they did nothing. Workers also often live in areas with waterways that are polluted by chemicals from textile dyeing. Many of them are underage, they are underpaid, overworked, and exposed to dangerous conditions and health hazards. Importantly, 80% of garment workers are women and women of color. With no other options available to them, they are forced to work in unsafe factory conditions with limited access to fresh air or natural lighting. Sanitation, edible food, and potable water are also largely inaccessible, making heat exhaustion and dehydration prevalent. Worst of all, gender-based violence is very commonplace inside of these garment factory workplaces. Okay, so I realized that that was a lot, but this is all meant to illustrate that while both industries are questionable, the fashion industry is by leagues far worse than the publishing industry in all sectors, whether it's contributing to deforestation for wood pulp or carbon emissions, from product transportation to exploiting human labor. In most, if not all cases, the fashion industry is the worst of the two evils. Before I move on to wrapping up this video, though, I still have a couple of other points that I want to make that have been on my mind concerning this comparison between book publishing and the fast fashion industry, not just from this environmental and human labor standpoint, but also the sociocultural standpoint, if you'll allow me to have a little bit of an academic moment. Something I wanted to bring up is that mass market paperbacks, like the lower quality book, let me show you an example. This type of book, that's upside down. This type of book, the mass market paperback, they are standardized in size, they are glued and not bound with thread, and they fall apart much faster than, say, a hardback cover with a special dust sleeve that is glued and thread bound to a certain extent, has a hard cover. It's going to last longer than this. Additionally, a lot of mass market paperbacks are often seen as lower quality writing, aka let's call them the fast fashion of the book industry. This mode of publishing has existed in the publishing industry for a long time. There are already authors out there that publish at breakneck speeds and publishing houses that make tons of copies of these lower quality books. My Name is Marinez has also pointed out plenty of mediocre at best books that have blown up in popularity before this idea of fast fashion was applied to BookTok. But she points out namely Twilight, 50 Shades of Grey, Sarah J. Maas, Colleen Hoover. They are all easy reading and easy consumption. They're just basically easy books to coast through, in my opinion, because they're written fast, not the best quality of writing, and published fast. So why is it that we're all of a sudden making a fuss? I have a few theories. One is, of course, social media just makes everything more visible, right? Like, take my mom, for example. I didn't think I was going to talk about this, but I have to. Every other month, maybe, my mom and I would go to Borders, remember when that existed? And she would go haywire with the buying of books. Over the top. Granted, my mother does actually read all of the books that she buys. I've never seen someone who reads as much, as prolifically as my mother does. But the point is, this was back in the early thousands. My mom would go to Borders and she would buy a lot of books. She would also buy a lot of these mass market paperbacks that she would call reading candy. Like Christine Feehan, for example. Silly romance novels that she can fly through in an afternoon. But the thing is, nobody saw her doing it except for me. The second point, and speaking of my mom, is that with BookTok being largely made up of women, many more women are visible. And I think that there's a correlation between a phenomenon consisting largely of women and then criticisms being levied against that phenomenon. Because I'll point out that some of the most prolific male writers, like take Stephen King for example, do not receive nearly the same level of scrutiny when it comes to bad writing, bad publishing, etc., etc. So I do definitely believe that there's a level of misogyny going on here. That's my take on that part, at least, that BookTok is largely made up of women. It makes us much more visible, and anytime women are trying to enjoy something, people don't like that. Misogyny, yay. The next thing I want to point out is that books last a lot longer than fast fashion items do. Sorry, we're bringing it back to this comparison between books and fast fashion. I realized that there was a tangent there, we're bringing it back to fashion. I want to say even mass market paperbacks and books that were published with poor quality due to rushed publication still last longer than fast fashion items. What makes fast fashion so pernicious and harmful to the environment is not only its upstream production, such as like chemicals and dye, use of pesticides, growing raw materials, carbon emissions, etc., etc. but that downstream, after a consumer has bought such an item, it gets thrown away. Fast fashion is fast not only because it's made quickly, but also because it's consumed quickly. Its poor quality has often led people to only wear something a handful of times before it starts to fall apart. And with its lack of quality, there's no reason to repair it when you can just throw it away and buy a new one for less than it would cost to repair it and for less time than it would take for you to learn to repair it yourself. And when a fast fashion garment ends up in the landfill, as we saw, being typically made of polyester, as they degrade, they release microplastics as well as other things like forever chemicals such as BPAs and PFAs, but most importantly, carbon into the environment as they degrade. But books? Even if we're buying a lot of books, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that people aren't just throwing away their books unless something happens to them and they get damaged. At least in my case, and most of the people I know, we hold on to our books. Books we haven't read yet because we're going to read them, books we have read and we want to keep for reference, for sentimental reasons, or to reread, or because they're part of a set, whatever the reason may be. And if a book doesn't stay in the house, it's far more likely to end up in some kind of circular economy after it's left our hands, often being donated to thrift stores, to libraries, little free libraries, being handed down to a friend, donated to schools, to prisons, etc., etc. It's a much more common and accepted practice to circulate secondhand books, whereas secondhand fashion, on the other hand, has received a bad rap until really the last decade or so, when secondhand fashion has lost most of its negative connotations and become a more popular form of consumption. See, secondhand fashion used to be associated with being poor and with having poor hygiene and not being modern or not being up with the times, because fashion really is a symbol of wealth. Owning a secondhand book is not as much of a signifier of these negative connotations as secondhand fashion. However, secondhand fashion has started to lose some of these negative connotations, which I am all for. I have some last minute rapid fire points that I want to make. These are the last things I will say before we wrap it up with a little conclusion. I promise, I know I have talked a lot in this video, but thank you so much for being here. Let's go. All right, first, fast fashion is also cheap. Books are not. I mostly buy my books secondhand simply because I can't afford to buy new books. So there's another reason why they are not the same. It is much easier to buy a lot of fast fashion and not a lot of books. Number two, we all have to wear clothes. Whether you like it or not, we live in a society where we are expected to clothe ourselves. But you don't have to read books. You should definitely be reading books and learning how to read books critically, but the point of the matter is that we do have to spend money on clothes to clothe ourselves. We don't have to buy books. And lastly, you can read books digitally, but you can't wear digital clothes. Digital fashion is something that is like having a teeny tiny bit of a moment in the fashion industry right now, but regardless of whether or not digital fashion takes off, we still have very real corporeal bodies that need to be protected from the elements, therefore they need to be clothed. So to bring all of this into some kind of conclusion, to wrap it all up, am I saying that TikTok and social media doesn't exacerbate overconsumption? No, of course not. There is a relationship between consumption and social media. The virality of the internet fuels the raging wildfire that is this capitalist hellscape of overconsumption, but the problems are always more nuanced than pointing fingers and blaming consumers. Of course, consumer attitudes, culture, and behavior absolutely needs to change if we're going to change these systems generally. However, I do have a bit of a gripe with us calling people consumers, but that's a story for another video. But targeting these issues, especially where fashion is concerned at the policy level, at government level, regulations, law, and enforcement is really where true change is going to come from. And in agreeing with my name is Marinez, the idea of fast fashion is directly applicable to the publishing industry in this case. We should be pointing our fingers at the publishing companies for making these choices to use rapid production models that result in these poor quality books. This is why we need more legally binding regulations, and in the case of fashion, I want to bring your attention to two specific acts, the Fabric Act and the Garment Workers Act, both of which are aiming to increase garment worker protections, fair wage, as well as more regulation concerning environmental impact in the fashion industry. I will leave links to both of those in the description box below for you to check out on your own time. I think that they're super important to look at and they deserve our attention and support. So, in conclusion, you can see that there's like a stark difference both in the environmental and the human labor impact between the two industries, which is why I actually have a problem with a comparison being drawn between the two. I can see how if like borrowing the language can help us start a conversation that's discussing the issue of overconsumption at large, that there's some validity in that, but for the most part, I think it detracts away from the really important conversations that we've been having about the fashion industry, especially the issues that the fashion industry has caused at mass scales. And because this conversation is only seemingly now picking up traction as like thrifting, secondhand, vintage, slow fashion, and other more sustainable modes of consumption are gaining popularity, I don't think we should be taking our attention away from that to point fingers when what we should be doing is educating one another, encouraging alternative models of consumption, and doing the work to support the policy that will actually provide protections both for the climate and the people. For an industry that has been so incredibly horrifically bad for everyone and everything, I think it deserves to have the attention and criticism on it and not conflated with something else. Because the more that our attention is taken away from the issues at hand that really matter, the more that these industries will continue to get away with these bad practices. Which, on that note, I really recommend reading How to Do Nothing: Resisting the Attention Economy. It's a book that has some interesting ideas, although I do have some gripes about the author, but we're getting away from ourselves again. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please share your thoughts and comments about this topic in the comments below. It's something I've been thinking about for a while and something I really wanted to get off my chest, especially because I think we really need to have a conversation about both the environmental impact, but also that very real human labor exploitation that goes into garment production. That's my piece. Again, thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to let me know in the comments so I can start making more of them, and stay tuned for future thesis writing crises as I go into the final year of my grad school program. All right, that's that. I'm gonna stop talking. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye. Did you guys notice I have my bookstore mug today? Commercial forestry for timber and wool.